Hey guys, author MJ Gallagher here, and welcome back to Rebirth Revealed, a series presented and funded by KupoCon. This episode covers the main story content of Chapter 7, Those Left Behind. Spoilers beyond this part of the game are minimal, but as always, please beware of likely spoilers for the original Final Fantasy VII, its remake, and the compilation in general. So let's hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and climb on in. Following their unpleasant encounter with Professor Hojo at the Costa del Sol beach, which required a ninjutsu magic intervention from the dynamic duo of Yuffie and Johnny, the party spends the night at the latter's seaside inn. Johnny bids them farewell the next morning, but if you look closely, you might spy a suspicious, poncho-clad figure perched on a large boulder in the background. As Cloud and the others approach Yuffie, she draws their attention and performs a flamboyant introduction that's very similar to the one featured in episode Intermission, the DLC for Final Fantasy VII Remake, in which Yuffie is the lead character. In that instance, however, her theatrics were for the benefit of Shinra troopers interrogating her Avalanche contact, Zhizhe, and it's the precise moment she unveils her traditional outfit. The reuse of assets here is probably why Yuffie initially appears in her poncho, despite the heat of Costa del Sol. Among the minor differences in the respective sequences is that in episode Intermission, she calls herself the single white rose of Wutai, whereas in Rebirth, it's Wutai's white rose. These are interchangeable and are a callback to the scene in Dirge of Cerberus where it's revealed she rescued Vincent from Rosso the Crimson, which was the first time the epithet was used in the compilation. Yuffie then challenges Cloud to a duel for the right to join the team, prompting a variety of dialogue options. This reflects the process of recruiting her in the original game. Once the player has defeated the mysterious ninja in battle, they must respond to her in a particular order, and failure to do so will result in her running off. Yuffie becomes a mandatory addition to the group in Rebirth, but there are still some fun references. For example, if Cloud agrees to the duel, the girl will get nervous and tactically retreat, only to come back and try again. But if he's dismissive of her advances, the reverse psychology will have her pleading to accompany them. Barrett also issues a very specific threat. If Yuffie tries anything funny, he'll shove her in the sister ray, point it at Wutai, and blast her back home. As indicated in Chapter 4 of Rebirth, Junon's Mako Cannon is a Shinra weapon capable of striking Wutai from long range. It also requires an extraordinary amount of Mako 2 fire, so it would be counterintuitive for Avalanche to do so. Navigating the tropical paradise west of Costa del Sol, the side content of which I will return to in a future video, the group eventually arrives at the foot of the Mount Corel hiking trail, but the ropeway system there is out of service and seems pretty derelict. The ropeway is a new addition in Rebirth, as only the route between North Corel and the Gold Saucer exists in the old game, and it's unclear if it was built for the benefit of travellers or for construction workers at the regional Mako reactor. Curiously, it wouldn't be the first time a Final Fantasy VII title included such transport facilities for Shinra employees. Before Crisis contains a similar scene in a cable car on Mount Nebel. The banter between Yuffie and Barrett really begins to take off as the party ascends the mountain trail, culminating in the pair, and Tifa, continuing on ahead, while Cloud and Red 13 slow to support the tiring Aerith. Not to worry though, as Yuffie leaves behind a number of chalk drawings as directional markers. These serve as a little nod to Remake and the use of stamped graffiti for guidance, but the cartoonish artwork is hilarious as it also tells a short story. They sequentially depict Barrett growing exasperated and making Yuffie cry, then Tifa scolding him for it. If you look closely, you might additionally spot that the arrow itself is simply one of the blades from the ninja's 4-point shuriken. Another callback to Remake occurs while their comrades are scaling a wall, and Red 13 remarks that he'll carry Aerith if she passes out. At the start of Chapter 7 in that game, Red 13 discloses to Cloud that he carried the blonde swordsman to Aerith's old chambers in the Shinra building after he collapsed in Hojo's lab. Something I personally felt was a really great touch here is the optional conversation with the resting hiker. He complains about the poor manners and etiquette of those who failed to greet him as they passed, including the black-robed men and Yuffie. This mirrors the original and how the lone NPC on the trek up Mount Corel mentions a cloaked individual ignoring him when he warned of dangers ahead. Near the summit, the team discovers Rude and Elena at the helipad of the reactor construction site, dropping off several robed figures. Rather than provoking a rematch of the Turks' battle at the Mithril mine, Elena simply summons the custom Valkyrie to deal with their enemy, referring to it as a she. What's interesting about this is that the closest equivalent to the mountain climb in Final Fantasy VII Remake is the ascent of the collapsed Sector 7, which occurs in Chapter 15. The boss for that chapter is the Valkyrie. Meanwhile, a smaller version of the custom Valkyrie itself can be seen amongst the assembly line of heli gunners during Yuffie's infiltration of the Advanced Weaponry Division in episode Intermission. It's perhaps no coincidence that the defeat of the custom Valkyrie leads to a transition into two separate scenes. The first of these relates to Shinra's pursuit of the Magnus Materia, a subplot connected to Yuffie's objective in the DLC, while the second relates to the return of Zack and the mystery surrounding his survival. After all, in Viking legend, the Valkyries are female shield maidens who are closely associated with warriors slain in battle. For the purposes of this video, I've swapped the order of the scenes, so we'll now join Zack at an abandoned house in Midgar's Sector 5 slums. If you recall from the initial episode in this series, I spoke about this being an alternative existence in which the former soldier has not been killed, as was his fate in the original Final Fantasy VII and its prequel Crisis Core. Zack is awoken by knocking at the door, and the player is given control of the character for the first time since Rebirth's opening sequence. Even in this brief moment, there are a couple of interesting things to point out. In the story breakdown section, Zack's scenario is listed under Interlude, a world apart. Interlude is an intriguing word choice, because it can simply mean a pause or interval from something, such as Rebirth's main plot, but it's also a synonym for intermission, and is typically used in the context of theatrical performances. Zack, of course, is the lead protagonist of Crisis Core, a game that happens to be deeply connected to the play Loveless. I'll discuss this more in future episodes. If you access the map screen here, you can also see the exact location of the abandoned house. It's at the southern end of Sanctuary Way, a short distance from the Sector 5 train station. The menu screen has another couple of fun Easter eggs. Zack will move in one of 4 ways each time you enter. These include performing his trademark squats, which Cloud unwittingly inherited from him in the original game, and touching the blade of the Buster Sword to his forehead, which Zack learned from his mentor Angeal in Crisis Core. The visitor to the house is Elmira, the adoptive mother of Aerith, whom Zack had left a secret note for, regarding her daughter's whereabouts. Elmira seems to double check that it is Zack who opens the door, which could be chalked up to her anxious state, but it does imply that the two aren't familiar. According to Crisis Core, Zack and Aerith dated each other for more than a year before he was sent on the ill-fated assignment to Nibelheim, so he could be forgiven for expecting him to be better acquainted with Elmira. Upstairs, Zack draws attention to the white material on the bedside table. This is a critical point because it further reiterates that they are in an alternative existence, or another world, given Aerith and Red 13's conversation about her empty materia in the previous chapter. Zack and Elmira then transport the incapacitated Cloud and Aerith back to the Gainsborough estate. En route, Zack asks what's going on, and Elmira responds that the people believe the world is ending. These words are a bit more complex than they may initially appear, but that's a discussion for a later video. For now, it's worth highlighting that the giant rift in the sky is reminiscent of the backdrop to Cloud's fragmented psyche during the livestream sequence in the original Final Fantasy VII, as well as having a vague resemblance to the rain cloud formation on the cover art of the 2022 remaster Crisis Core Reunion. That art of course features Zack, Cloud, and Sephiroth. The interlude ends with a transition back to Aerith on Mount Corel. She gazes skyward, as if sensing something, and goes on to wonder how Elmira is doing back in Midgar. There's a long-running association between Aerith and the sky, stemming back to the day she first met Zack and admitted to him that she fears the natural firmament, instead preferring the steel sky of Midgar's plate. Interestingly, to coincide with the release of Rebirth, a line of dialogue was changed in the English version of Final Fantasy VII Remake's ending. Rather than "I miss it, the steel sky," the line is now "the sky, I don't like it." Time will tell if this apprehension is simply an extension of her Crisis Core confession, or if it connects in any way to the rift that's now visible to Zack. Meanwhile, at Shinra headquarters, President Rufus is meeting with several of the company directors about the Magnus Materia project. As he discusses the energy spikes detected simultaneously at Mako reactors around the world, the map screen behind him displays facilities in Midgar, Corel, and Gongaga. Given the weapon the player party is about to encounter at Corel, the implication is that similar lifeforms are present in reactors at both Gongaga and Midgar. This is a relatively new aspect to Final Fantasy VII's story, but it's not entirely without precedent. For example, during Dirge of Cerberus, Deepground manifests the Omega weapon in the Mako reservoir of Reactor 0. When Hojo sees images of the creature, he recognises it as a weapon and says he's dreamt of capturing one, which means he's been aware of their existence for some time. This is actually consistent with the original game, where he advises Rufus at the Northern Crater that he'd reviewed Professor Gast's report on the subject, but didn't believe they were real. The old video recording in question can be accessed by the player in Gast and Defalna's lodgings at Icicle Inn. Moreover, Scarlet is also present at the Northern Crater and comments on the abundance of materia there, which may have inspired Rebirth's tie-in to the Magnus Materia. The Magnus Materia itself is first mentioned by Glenn Lodbrok during his exchange with Rufus at Junon. They conspire to manufacture conflict over it, and Rufus presents this to the directors as Wutai seeking power. I've spoken already in this series about the President's history with Avalanche and his talent for playing both sides. What's fascinating about this particular scenario, however, is that we learn the Magnus Materia is the naturally occurring version of the so-called Ultimate Materia Scarlet was trying to create in episode Intermission. Thus Yuffie's assignment in the DLC is directly linked to Glenn and Rufus's plot. Yuffie is acting on the orders of Wutai's interim government, while her Avalanche contact, Zhizha, explicitly names Rufus as his source when being interrogated by Shinra officers. The expression on his face even suggests that's the true answer. And yes, this is the exact same interrogation I alluded to at the start of the episode. Yuffie provides further context to this when the group reaches the Corel reactor. There's a brief flashback to Shinra's invasion of Wutai, featuring the Crab Warden fought by Cloud, Barrett and Tifa in Chapter 5 of Remake, as well as the death of Melfi, who was the younger sister of Sonon, the ninja that accompanies Yuffie during episode Intermission. She explains that when the leaders of Wutai were on the brink of agreeing a ceasefire with Shinra, against the will of the people, Colonel Lodbrok's team showed up. The names of the other two ex-soldiers are not given, but this is a likely reference to Matt and Lucia, who are under Glenn's command during the initial episode of the First Soldier storyline in Ever Crisis. In a bid to preserve Wutai's independence, the leaders were deposed and the interim government was established by Glenn and the mysterious Viceroy Saruf. A Viceroy is someone who exerts authority over a colony on behalf of its sovereign. Make of that what you will. As a side note, Cloud asks Yuffie to confirm the Colonel's name, but doesn't react to it in any way when she responds with Lodbrok. I mentioned in my Dune on Upper City video that Glenn's surname is probably derived from the legendary Viking warrior Ragnar Lodbrok, but it should be noted that Lodbrok, which means hairy breeches, is a moniker, not a family name. This could be another piece of evidence in the debate about the identity of Cloud's father. The design of the Corel reactor itself is significantly different to its presentation in the original game, but it does better align with the lore that the facility was destroyed several years ago. Its devastating collapse was even depicted in Chapter 17 of Before Crisis, having been sabotaged by the militant branch of Avalanche. As it happens, this coincided with Rufus Shinra being revealed as Avalanche's financier. In the old Final Fantasy VII though, some areas of the reactor were still functioning, as there was sufficient power to the building and an operational railway terminus. Based on the environment here, I think it's safe to presume the huge materia train chase won't be showing up in Part 3. That said, the appearance of the weapon with a giant orb of Magnus materia in its body is certainly comparable to the huge materia. As I highlighted in an earlier video, Magnus is the Latin word for great. It's fairly clear that this Guardian of the Planet, as Red 13 calls it, is not as large as the colossal weapons encountered in Final Fantasy VII, but for the avoidance of doubt, Rebirth's Ultimania does clarify that the life forms seen in this game are infants. The party takes an old elevator down the western side of the mountain to reach the coal mines. Corel is described in Final Fantasy VII as having been a mining town, and the natural resource was its primary commodity. Like many of its denizens, Barrett and his best friend Dine came from families of miners. In fact, during Before Crisis, the player Turk has to navigate these caverns to prevent Avalanche's imminent attack on the reactor. Along the way, they are assisted by Barrett himself, and part of the gameplay is to push minecarts around. The fallen cars here may be a little nod to that. Outside, the group discovers that the railway bridge needs to be lowered from the control terminal on a distant cliff top. While this does parallel a brief scene in the old game, the new addition of the robed figures is interesting. Their plunge into the river below triggers one of Cloud's ominous headaches, and he steps towards the platform edge. This could relate to the suspicious similarity of the Black Robes' movements here to them throwing themselves into the crater at the Whirlwind Maze during Final Fantasy VII, a location Cloud had visions of in Remake. Alternatively, it's simply a nod to the minigame in the original, where sections of the track collapse and Cloud must climb back up the crossbeams. With the blonde swordsman incapacitated, Yuffie, not Barrett, takes charge on accessing the bridge controls. Despite Barrett's knowledge of the area, he's obviously not suited to lead, primarily because he already had his turn at being the main character in the Mithril Mine. The last time Yuffie was playable for an extended period, of course, was episode intermission, so it makes sense that the sequence would utilise some of the DLC's mechanics. This includes throwing the young ninja's shuriken at numerous switches, riding the vertical conveyors between floors in the preparation plant, or earning some cool rewards from a target practice minigame that transitions the characters from one map to another. There's also a loose lore connection between Yuffie and the Corel mines, because remnants of the Wutai Army's elite force, the Crescent Unit, established a hideaway in these caverns after the war. During the soldier missions of Crisis Core, Zack is sent to eliminate them. Another great callback, pardon the pun, is the reappearance of the PHS terminal as a means of swapping between parties. This also features in the drum during Remake's Chapter 17, but it's a reimagining of the PHS from the original, officially named the Personal Handyphone System according to the Ultimania Omega, which was how the player transferred characters in and out of their main team. Arguably my favourite Easter egg in this scenario is the battle to protect some chicks against a Gigatrice. In the old Final Fantasy VII, Cloud can climb a wall near the control booth to discover a nest of newborn chicks. If the player chooses to steal treasure from the nest, they'll be forced to fight a mother cockatrice. or Cockatolis in the English localisation. Once the Gigatrice is defeated, the spiky feathered chick, dubbed Cloud Jr. by Yuffie, flies from the nest and eventually perches on Barrett's head. This could be a reference to Final Fantasy XIII and the character Saz, who keeps a chocobo chick nestled in his hair. The reception of the North Corel locals to Barrett's homecoming is just as brutal as it was in the original. Like before, he makes no attempt to defend himself against the verbal abuse hurled his way, nor does he allow his comrades to stand up for him. We'll return to the reason for this shortly, but for now I'd like to highlight some points of interest. In the old game, North Corel was essentially a tent settlement of survivors that had formed around a couple of rundown buildings. Rebirth's incarnation, however, has much more of a shantytown feel to it, with the area map identifying the upper tiers as the former miners' quarters. This means the residential and industrial parts of North Corel existed prior to the reactor explosion. Interestingly, the ropeway station is no longer the sole, or even primary, means of accessing the Gold Saucer, and it's subsequently confirmed to be a transportation service for park staff. This lends believability to Rebirth's world building in that the displaced mining community now relies on the Gold Saucer for employment, hence the sizable population of North Corel. Nevertheless, there are some neat references to the original, such as the sign for the station having a painted image of the old game's ropeway car, the elderly man who still thinks he's a train engineer, the dilapidated inn with its less than inviting beds, and an NPC who seems to be suffering from a degree of trauma due to working for the boss. I'll discuss this further in the next episode. There's also a wonderful little compilation Easter egg here if you know where to look, or more precisely, listen. I spoke in my Upper Junon video about Old Man Sakaki, a figure mentioned in the Barrett chapter of the official novella On the Way to a Smile by Kazushige Najima. Sakaki is responsible for crafting the special adapter on Barrett's arm, which allows him to attach any prosthetic limb, tool or weapon he desires. If you eavesdrop on the two guys tending the broken vegetable cart, they're having a conversation about Sakaki, claiming he could fix it in no time, but he's currently on a journey. As a side note, Sakaki briefly appears during the first Barrett mini-episode in Ever Crisis, which became available shortly before Rebirth's release. The same episode reveals that Barrett's introduction to planetology came from travelling practitioners who provided him with milk to feed baby Marlene, then later being welcomed at a planetology education centre when he literally had nowhere else to go. It's there that he met Jesse and was persuaded to join Avalanche. Perhaps the planetologist preaching outside a bar called Rock Bottom is an allusion to this. Incidentally, Cloud Jr. and his mother are now perched on one of the bar's exterior advertising panels. A nearby group of miners recognise the larger bird as Lil Chirpy, who, in her youth, helped warn them of gas in the mines, just as canaries historically did in real life. Easily the most significant change to the North Corel sequence is the presence of Doc Sheiran's clinic. If you recall, I name-dropped the good doctor way back in my Chapter 1 breakdown, because he's referenced in the novel Traces of Two Pasts as the individual who saved Tifa's life after Sephiroth injured her at Nibelheim. Barrett knows him too, of course, and it was Sheiran who amputated his forearm after he was shot by Scarlet. Tifa takes the opportunity to thank the doctor for his help, but he replies that she should instead thank Lady Luck and the Shinra helicopter that brought her here. This is a curious tidbit of information, because Master Zangan's secret letter in the old game, as well as Traces of Two Pasts, Before Crisis and even Last Order, suggest it was Tifa's martial arts instructor who carried her away from Nibelheim. When Cloud enters the clinic, he sees Sephiroth and tries to attack, only to realise it is instead one of the black-robed figures. This is a callback to Chapter 3 of Remake, when Cloud does the same with Marco at Stargazer Heights. Doc Sheiran takes a blood sample from the man, then tells the group that previous tests have shown an unfamiliar substance to be present, similar to one he's previously seen in soldiers. He suspects the men are suffering from cellular degradation, a subject I discussed in my Grasslands video, but Cloud refuses to help by giving a blood sample of his own. This makes sense from a plot perspective because Cloud was injected with S cells, not the G cells that typically lead to soldier degradation, meaning the discrepancy can't be uncovered by Sheiran. And finally, the chapter draws to a close with Barrett sharing some details on why the people of North Corel hold him responsible for the devastation here. The flashback takes place 6 years prior, and eventually settles on a scene reminiscent of the corresponding sequence in Final Fantasy VII, where the mayor has gathered several denizens to discuss the prospect of allowing Shinra to construct a regional Mako reactor. Barrett is a strong advocate for this, despite protests that it will decimate their coal industry. Among those opposing the motion is Dain, his best friend. There are some pretty great details here. For example, Barrett obviously still has both his hands, but he also has his facial scars and burning skull tattoo, confirming the origins of these are separate. Dain, meanwhile, has a pendant around his neck, comprised of a bullet and golden locket. This has some lore relevance, which I'll return to in the next episode. Just as in the original, it's Director Scarlet who has been sent by Shinra to persuade the people of Corel. Therefore, Scarlet has been established as a personal villain for both Yuffie and Barrett in this chapter, through episode Intermission and the Magnus Materia, and now with respect to the Corel reactor. This is an important point to keep in mind for later in Rebirth. As a side note, in the present, there's a woman sitting behind the rock bottom bar who, despite the time that's passed and the events that have unfolded, still seems enchanted by the blonde beauty. She says she'll never forget Scarlet and fawns over her red dress and perfume. This represents a microcosm of Shinra's powers in misinformation and manipulation. To conclude, I'd like to bring your attention to Barrett's line of dialogue in the English version of the game, where he tells Dain that this is a chance to give his daughter a better life. I apologise if this is a minor spoiler for new players, but Dain, not Barrett, is the biological father of Marlene, who's the daughter they're referring to. However, this appears to have been an oversight by the localization team, as Marlene is officially aged 4 in both Final Fantasy VII and the Remake continuity, meaning 6 years ago she wouldn't yet have been born. Conversely, Marlene isn't mentioned in the Japanese script, and Barrett's line is much closer to the original. He instead pleads to end the suffering of his wife Myrna. Well everyone, that's all for now. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and I invite you to check out all future episodes on KupoCon's channel. If you're interested in the lore side of things, my own books, Norse myths that inspired Final Fantasy VII and Greek myths that inspired Final Fantasy VII, are both available on Amazon. As always, I'd especially like to thank all of KupoCon's Patreon subscribers for your continued support. Without your backing, productions such as this would not be possible. If you're not already a patron, please do consider joining for some incredible KupoCon exclusives. But for now, take care. I'm NJ Gallagher, and I'll speak to you again soon.